What's happening, everyone? Henry Films here. We're back with another Red Dead Redemption video. Today's video is going to be the topic that won the recent community poll I did on which video would be next, and that is ranking all of the gangs in Red Dead Redemption 2. Now, gang can be kind of a vague term, so there's going to be some honorable mentions I'll throw in there right now. I won't be including, like, the Watson boys, because they're more like a one-off series of, like, one or two encounters you'll have, and then they're out of the picture, and the content they're in is completely optional side content you just stumble across. They're a one-and-done thing. They're not a reoccurring thread, a reoccurring presence throughout the story. I also won't be including the night folk on this list, because even though they're really cool, and you do have a bit more interactions with them than you do the Watson boys, they're still not like an organized gang in any sense, with any sort of monetary or political motive at all. They don't have any motive. They're essentially animals. They're these feral swamp people. They're almost supernatural in their savagery. They're like zombies, and there's all sorts of like Creole, voodoo, Louisiana folklore that's in there. And it's just so far removed from being like a Western bandit gang to me that I figured I'll throw them in as an honorable mention, but they're not going to be on the list. And then, of course, the Vanderlyn gang isn't going to be on this ranking. I feel like that's kind of obvious as to why it just seems unfair to rank the main cast of characters to nameless NPCs. So I'll be ranking the 6 main gangs from Red Dead Redemption 2 based on aesthetic, personal preference, story significance, historical significance, all your standard criteria in all my videos, all my ranking videos. So yeah, let's get to it. In last place is the Laramie gang. The Laramie gang isn't bad, it's just the most, I guess, nondescript gang in the game, so to speak. They're also one of the least dangerous. They're just kind of thugs. They're bullies. Classic Western cattle rustlers and petty bandits. I do like that about them. The fact that they're quite literally just bad cowboys, stealing livestock and harassing the ranch hands at Pronghorn. So I guess they're historically accurate in that sense, more so than other gangs, which is cool. And they do have one of the coolest gang hideouts in the game. Hanging Dog Ranch is an awesome name. That's super menacing and evil sounding. They also have some great style, that traditional western wear, but it's for a colder climate. It's like winter western wear. But yeah, it's colder in the northern part of West Elizabeth, and even though it's cold, they're in a great spot. Big Valley is probably my favorite region on the map visually. It's striking and picturesque. It looks like a painting. Well, I mean, all of Red Dead looks like a painting, but Big Valley especially, that region. It looks like those idyllic nature graphics you'd see on water bottles or beer or granola bars, that type of aesthetic. They're the Bob Ross bandits, if you will, living in one of his paintings. Story-wise, they're actually the main antagonists for like half a chapter in the game, which is more than most of the gangs on this list have to say, but they really don't have much to show for it. The gang lacks a certain sauce that's present in each of the other groups on this list, so let's move on to the next. The Murphy Brood are so damn creepy and gross, they're without a doubt the most off-putting of any of the gangs. Their character models are so horrifically inbred, and their skin is coated in boils and sores. It's actually impressive how disgusting and ugly Rockstar managed to get these guys. I mean, just look at them. I get real Texas Chainsaw, The Hills Have Eyes vibes coming from it. Roanoke Ridge is a really neat stand-in for the forested hills of Appalachia, and this entire region is super eerie. Beaver Hollow also serves as a fitting breeding ground for these troglodytes as their hideout. The mutilated limbs and corpses strewn about especially make for a very warm and homey vibe. But yeah, the Murphy Brood doesn't have much story significance, but they are one of the gangs I encounter most often because even far into the epilogue, I still get random encounters almost constantly, pretty much anytime I'm in Roanoke Ridge or by Ansburg, by Van Horn. Granted, they're like the same 1 or 2 encounters, but it's always fun. The voice actors all knock it out of the park when hamming it up as these filthy degenerates, and your interactions with them make for a lot of equally creepy and funny line readings. They're not super intimidating, they're more like pests than they are a genuine threat, but still a welcome addition to the game and very different from all the other gangs. The Skinner brothers are actually pretty similar to the Murphy Brood. Ugh, I hate that name. They're pretty similar to the Brood, albeit without the inbreeding. They're the terror of the Tall Trees region and anyone unlucky enough to pass through. In a lot of instances, I think I actually found the Skinner brothers scarier a little than the Murphy Brood, because a lot of the interactions involving the Skinner brothers don't feature any Skinners actually present most of the time, just the gruesome aftermath, which is almost more ominous and makes them like phantoms, almost supernatural. There's this one particularly haunting interaction where you find a dying man freshly scalped, and he's trembling and he's screaming his way through recounting the horrors he had just experienced. It's chilling stuff. But my favorite random encounter that triggers with them is far more subtle. It's when you just find a wagon covered by arrows. The rider's hunched over and also completely porcupined by arrows. The first few times I encountered this in the epilogue, I assumed it was hinting towards the work of like a hostile native tribe, which got me really excited that maybe there was an antagonistic tribe in the game, because the Wapiti were allies pretty much. Something that could serve as this game's allegory to the Apache or Comanche out in the plains. But I can understand the murky politics behind portraying Native Americans in a villainous light when you're playing as a white cowboy, I get it. Plus, when you're looking at the character models of the Skinners anyways, it seems that a good number of them, hell, maybe even more than half, are native. I think that's cool since there's literally no native presence in this Western game apart from the Wapiti. I understand, there's political reasons behind that, and the portrayal of natives in the Western genre has been iffy, if he's putting it lightly. But they're like a huge part of the American West, and it would have been cool to see more of them in the open world. I really like the outfits of the Skinner brothers. They feel really historical. They remind me a lot of the fur trappers and hunters in The Revenant. Next on the list is the Del Lobo gang. I have a soft spot for the Del Lobos, and if I wasn't attempting to be kind of somewhat objective, I'd probably have them at number 1. They're the most traditional of all the gangs in the game to me, fulfilling that classic archetype of the gang of Mexican banditos terrorizing helpless little towns in the West. We see them doing just this in Tumbleweed and in Armadillo. Like, their confrontation with the Armadillo sheriff feels ripped straight from a Western dime novel or the original Magnificent Seven or something. I love the flamboyant ponchos, the giant sombreros, and the obnoxious bandoliers. It's almost like a cartoon. You know how like Looney Tunes used to portray banditos? The drip goes crazy, that's all I can say. Like the Murphy Brood, the voice actors for the Del Lobos definitely had a lot of fun over-the-top dialogue to sink their teeth into. The name too, Del Lobo, of the Wolf, that's just so sick. That shit is raw as hell. I like the lore going on between Sheriff Freeman and the gang in Tumbleweed, the mutual disdain both parties have for each other, and the constant struggle the sheriff faces holding Tumbleweed in such unforgiving circumstances, this town on the edge of civilization, in the middle of nowhere, terrorized by gangs. It's like a classic Western scenario. The bounties you do for Sheriff Freeman with the Del Lobos and their leaders, they just feel right. They feel classic. Like I said earlier, like a classic dime novel or television serial. Finally, when it comes to fulfilling your heart's desire for Wild West bandit action, the Del Lobos have the best location and hideouts all over the map. New Austin is a perfect western desert setting, and from Thieves Landing to Fort Mercer to the mine at Gaptooth Ridge, you can find Del Lobos in all sorts of picture-perfect western backdrops, each with their own flavor to add. Number 2, the O'Driscolls. So the O'Driscolls, without a doubt, have the most story significance out of all the gangs featured. Colm O'Driscoll and Dutch go way back, decades even. The resentment is deep, and it is mutual. This can't be said for any of the other gangs who, lore-wise, we encounter for the first time in the events of the story. So the familiarity and history between us and the O'Driscolls makes for some unique character interactions. Like, O'Driscoll straight up recognize you as one of Dutch's boys, sometimes even calling you by name. They call you Arthur Morgan. The O'Driscolls also have most of my favorite random encounters. They're very diverse in their content, but are all the exact same sort of traditional Western scenario I want to see in Free Roam. You can find the O'Driscolls mid-train robbery, holding up a stagecoach, drunkenly harassing saloon patrons, or mugging you for your horse. So sure, like the Lemoyne Raiders and Del Lobos can do a lot of the same, but not as widespread and varied as all the O'Driscoll interactions. They're all over the place. In terms of not just story, but also in scale, O'Driscoll's influence is all over RDR2. They're the only gang in the map to stretch beyond the borders of one state or region. It really does feel like they're everywhere, which is kind of the point. The game also makes a point to illustrate that Colm does not nearly have the same charisma or draw that Dutch does, so what Colm lacks in loyal and skilled guns, he makes up for in scale, overwhelming the enemies with any Joe Schmo that can hold a gun. You can see this especially in the Shady Belle shootout segment, where you're just mowing through O'Driscolls and it feels like they're never going to stop coming. If you couldn't tell by the name, the O'Driscolls' general ethnic makeup is Irish in the same way the Del Lobos are predominantly Mexican, so I do love the whole green theme they've got going. It's actually kind of wholesome to know that they all make sure to have their green on, to mark their Irish pride and all match with each other. Even Colm, look at his fancy green tie, that's so cute. It's St. Patty's Day every day when you're an O'Driscoll. Anyways, the O'Driscolls O'Driscolls are the only gang to really have a definitive end, because once Colm is hanged in the story, it seems like the O'Driscolls are more or less out of the picture entirely. I have not encountered them once in the epilogue. Is it even possible to see them? Or is it like an in-canon fact that they've disbanded since? Let me know if you've seen them past that mission. I haven't. I'm genuinely curious if that's a thing. But regardless, the fact that I do miss seeing them around the map, now that they're gone, should say something about how good of inclusion they were. Like, especially Valentine. They added so much life to that town, and their presence being there in the epilogue is greatly missed. So seeing as I love the O'Driscolls and Del Lobos for their traditional Wild West aesthetic, it might seem a bit odd to have the Lemoyne Raiders at number 1. Like, they're not even in the West, they're not even a gang, they're fighting for a political cause more so than monetary gain. They share more in common with domestic terrorists than they do cowboys or bandits. I get it, and it may not seem like it on the surface, but the Lemoyne Raiders have one of, if not the strongest historical basis out of any gang in the game. The concept of bushwhackers, that being Confederates still fighting for the Southern cause years after the war, has a deep-rooted history with the American West, from real historical figures like Jesse and Frank James and their gang, which were sympathetic to the Confederacy, for Western films like The Outlaw Josie Wales. Bushwhackers, guerrilla fighters, Confederate sympathizers, these have all been long part of the West. Which, when you stop and listen to Dutch's rantings and ravings for more than 5 seconds, it becomes apparent as to why. The anti-government and libertarian sentiments of the Confederacy align perfectly with the morality or lack thereof in a lawless West. And after the end of the American Civil War, the frontier became a refuge for young, angry, and violent men with bitterness towards their government and the resentment towards civilized society. Confederate militias like the Lemoyne Raiders, while sure, definitely heightened here in the game, absolutely existed long after the official ceasefire. So apart from the really cool historical influences, the Lemoyne Raiders also just bring so much to the table. Like the O'Driscolls, they just have so much content in the game and throughout the entire state of Lemoyne. Like, apart from the usual petty mugging and robberies, you can also encounter politically motivated attacks and vandalism. The Lemoyne Raiders also have some of the most interesting dialogue. Like, if you sneak into their camps, you'll hear some really fascinating internal conflict coming from these men, fighting for a lost cause, believing in something that will sooner end with them dead than it will bring the Old South back. It's almost like Dutch in a sense, desperately clinging to the idea of an untapped, lawless American frontier of utmost freedom, unable to accept the inevitable wave of change that's happening and really already happened. It's just a really cool inclusion, since a huge part of RDR2's pitch is expanding the traditional western setting of Red Dead's map further east to explore all the history that the eastern United States has to offer during this era. The inclusion of Confederate bushwhackers was a must-have, and I'm so glad they're included. When it comes to their look, they're dressed in disheveled, hobbled-together Confederate uniforms, most likely belonging to the fathers and grandfathers of the Raiders we see in the game, as the game is decades removed from the Civil War and most of the group is comprised of impressionable young men. Men who have never actually experienced life in the antebellum South, so it's easy for them to be swayed and manipulated by ideas of this utopian era before it was mercilessly encroached by the evil, overbearing Union. It's honestly quite sad, but not inaccurate to how actual terrorists and cults function. Of course, mixed in with them are actual Civil War veterans who are older, which are just as cool to see. They're fighting more out of spite and vengeance than they are genuine hope like these younger ones. I like to think that many of the older Raiders know this fight is a lost cause, but just don't care, as they have nothing to live for but their glory days, making their indoctrination of these younger members all the sadder and worse. I just think that the Lemoyne Raiders are such an interesting concept that I couldn't help but put them at number 1. They're just a great antagonist to have in the game, and a really interesting one at that. Great piece of world building, and to me, out of all the gangs, they leave the best impression. And that's going to be a wrap for today's video. Like always, if you've enjoyed, make sure to like, and if you enjoy this content and want to see more of it, subscribe. And finally, please, please, please leave video recommendations of content that you want to see. I'm always looking for recommendations. I want to put out the content that scratches your Wild West Red Dead Redemption itch. It can be anything from film, it can be literature, it can be history, it can be anything. Anything. Love the Wild West, and now that my channel has suddenly transformed itself into a Red Dead channel, I guess I'll talk more about the West. Why not? I don't mind. But anyways, I'll see you all next time. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you sleep well tonight and wake up tomorrow morning.